Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are cracking open a challenging and incredibly complex stack of sources. Our mission is to navigate the intense discourse surrounding women in formalized leadership roles. Think priests, pastors, rabbis, and imams across the three great Abrahamic traditions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
And for you listening, this is, well, it's an indispensable deep dive because it really forces us to confront how ancient scripture kind of butts up against modern notions of equity. These aren't just, debates about rules. They intersect with deeply held beliefs about divine command, human equality, and frankly, cultural adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you only take one realization from this deep dive, is that every argument in, every single faith ultimately funnels back to a single interpretive line drawn between two concepts. On one side, you have egalitarianism. That's the view that leadership is based purely on spiritual gift and calling, open to all genders.
Right. And then on the other side, you have complementarianism. Now, this framework insists that men and women are equal in value and dignity, both fully image bearers of God, but they possess distinct complementary roles. And that often results in mandating male authority or headship within the institutional religious sphere.
Okay, let's unpack this. Maybe we can start with what I've found to be the most compelling surprise the sources reveal: this historical reversal. It's striking how many powerful roles women held right at the birth of these faiths, only for those roles to be severely curtailed as the institutions mature.
It is a shocking pattern, yeah. And it completely defies that common modern narrative of just, unbroken male-only leadership from day one.
Exactly. So take Christianity. Women were absolutely the backbone of the movement's origins. They funded Jesus' ministry. They were his earliest, most faithful followers. And critically, Mary Magdalene was the first witness to the resurrection, a fact that actually earned her the title Apostle to the Apostles.
And you see specific formalized positions documented right there in the New Testament. Phoebe was a deacon, clearly fulfilling an official church function. Paul explicitly noted Junia as a prominent apostle in his letter to the Romans. Women led house churches. They were actively prophesying.
Yeah, it was happening. Yet the change arrived, pretty swiftly. By the 2nd century, as Christianity began to institutionalize and interact more with the broader Roman world, women's roles were, frankly, crushed. Movements that did ordain women, like Montanism, they were branded heretical. It seems like institutional survival often trumped doctrinal consistency in those early centuries.
And that Roman cultural influence is really key there. We see a similar pattern in Judaism. The biblical record gives us these powerful public leaders like the prophetess Miriam and Deborah, who was both a judge and a military commander. But the big shift seems to come after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, and then the rise of Rabbinic Judaism.
Right. That's when the Talmud, those foundational legal texts, really crystallized. The focus shifted towards domestic roles, which then led to women being exempted from certain public mitzvahs, the commandments, often on the grounds of prioritizing family duties. Historically, ordination as rabbis became strictly male-only, tied to that scholarly mastery of Jewish law or halakha, the whole legal structure of the faith.
And in Islam, again, the influence of women at the very start was just undeniable. Khadija was the Prophet Muhammad's first convert, giving crucial financial and emotional support. Aisha was this massive intellectual force, a scholar who transmitted thousands of hadiths. She wasn't just passive, she was an active historical player.
But again, institutionalization seemed to win out. Post-Caliphal eras, particularly around the 8th century, reinforced male imams for mixed congregations. And it seems they drew heavily on existing, often intensely patriarchal, tribal norms and power structures of the region at the time.
What the sources clearly highlight is that when these three faiths started dealing with empires, consolidating power, they started looking, a lot more like the patriarchal cultures they were interacting with, which meant, almost inevitably, pushing women to the side. There's even a sociological study in our stack that described this later progression as a sequential rise in female leadership, often decades or centuries later, and almost always driven by external pressures, like secular feminist movements forcing the conversation.
So we've seen the historical erasure, or at least marginalization. The next logical question is, how did they justify that shift theologically? Let's look at the passages they used to enforce that hierarchy. This is really where the interpretive war is currently being fought. Okay, in Christianity, the restrictive texts function like a kind of spiritual firewall. 1 Timothy 2.1114 is, it's the big one. It says, a woman is not permitted to teach or have authority over a man and must be silent. But what's critical is the rationale provided right there in the text. It's explicitly based on the created order Adam was formed first, and also the assignment of blame for original sin Eve was deceived.
Right, and this notion was heavily amplified by the early church fathers. Tertullian, for instance, famously went so far as to call women the devil's gateway. Think about that semantic shift from Mary Magdalene the Apostle to the Apostles to the Devil's Gateway in just a couple of hundred years. That really shows the sheer power of cultural accretion taking hold, doesn't it?
It really does. But the egalitarian rebuttal is often based on one of the most, well, revolutionary verses in the Bible. They argue that those restrictive passages were historically contextual, maybe addressing specific issues, like uneducated women disrupting worship in a particular congregation in Ephesus. The universal command, the absolute counterverse they point to, is Galatians 3.28, which posits that in Christ, earthly hierarchies are dismantled. There's neither male nor female, for you are all one.
And you find that same kind of restrictive reading strategy in Judaism. The traditional view often points back to Genesis 3.16, where subordination is established as a post-fall curse, often read prescriptively as a command. The Talmud reinforced this exclusion from authoritative public Torah study, and the language used can be quite harsh. Some rabbis preferred Torah words to be, quote, destroyed by fire than imparted to women.
Wow. And when we look at Islam, the key passage often cited for maintaining a male-led structure is Quran 4.34. This establishes qawama, or guardianship. It's often interpreted as men being in charge of women because of their duty to financially provide and maintain the household. And you add to that the famous hadith in Sahih Bukhari 7099 that issues a pretty stark warning. A people who entrust their affairs to a woman will never prosper.
Yeah. What's fascinating here, and you touched on it, is the core difference in interpretation between a prescriptive reading, meaning seeing it as a universal, unchanging command for all time, versus a descriptive reading, which treats the passage as merely reflecting the cultural or historical context of the time it was written.
That's the crux of it.
It is. And progressive readings consistently rely on that descriptive approach. They highlight counterexamples, like, women prophets who actually appear in the texts of all three faiths to challenge these androcentric, these male-centered lenses.
That distinction between prescription and description really is the fulcrum of the entire debate, isn't it? And it leads us directly into the modern articulation of hierarchy, which is complementarianism.
Exactly. And this term, while it's primarily used in conservative evangelical Christianity, it really describes a conceptual framework that has clear functional parallels across Orthodox Judaism and conservative Islam as well.
This is where we get into that definition, sometimes called soft patriarchy. Complementarianism insists on ontological equality equals soul value, reflecting Genesis 1.27. But it mandates relational or authoritative subordination. Men are designated for senior authoritative leadership, women for supportive, non-governing roles.
The rationale in Christianity circles right back to that core restrictive argument we mentioned. 1 Timothy 2.13 emphasizing Adam was formed first, and Ephesians 5, where wives submit as to the Lord. This then extends the family headship model directly into the church eldership role.
So it creates a clear boundary. Women can run the children's ministry, absolutely. They can teach other women, but they are absolutely barred from being a senior pastor or, teaching men publicly in an authoritative way. Critics are right to call this soft patriarchy because it insists on equal spiritual value while simultaneously mandating relational submission.
And we see that same kind of division of labor thinking elsewhere. In Judaism, the structure of halakha assigns men the public mitzvot, the public commandments, while exempting women, often citing family duties. This is viewed by traditionalists as a division of complementary burdens: public authority for men, family authority for women, a balance in their view.
Right. And in Islam, while the interpretation of qiyamah has traditionally meant male leadership due to the provision aspect, modern fatwas are increasingly emphasizing mutual consultation, reflecting the economic reality where women are, frankly, no longer exclusively tied to the domestic sphere in many places.
Yeah, the so what here is that this entire framework is being severely tested by modern secular life. These traditional structures persist robustly in, more closed communities, certainly, but they face immense pressure in pluralistic societies where women's workforce participation and economic independence directly challenge that traditional provision and protection model that underpins some of these roles.
Okay, let's fast forward because this is where the tectonic plates are really shifting right now. The contemporary discourse. We're seeing massive progress in some areas and, absolute trench warfare in others.
The spectrum in Christianity is just dizzying. You have the Episcopal Church beginning to ordain women priests way back in 1976. Contrast that seismic shift with the Southern Baptist Convention, which just recently in 2023 emphatically reaffirmed its position that only men can serve as pastors, and that caused massive internal conflict, kicking churches out.
Yeah, huge deal. And Judaism offers maybe the most vivid example of divergence. Reform Judaism, which welcomed its first female rabbi, Sally Priesand, back in 1972, has undergone a complete cultural transformation. Today, over 50% of their new rabbis are female. I mean, that's a profound reversal of history. Meanwhile, Orthodox Judaism maintains severe resistance, although you do see new titles like Rabbah emerging for highly advanced female scholars since around 2009. So some movement, but slow.
In Islam, the rise in the scholarly authority of women, the muhaddithat and jurists, is hugely significant. Women are reclaiming their intellectual legacy. However, the real flashpoint remains leading mixed congregations in prayer. Progressive communities in the West have had these highly controversial female imams like Amina Wadud back in 2005, but traditional fatwas instantly condemn this as bid'ah, forbidden innovation, striking right at the heart of established practice.
And even where women are allowed ordination or leadership roles, there is this clear barrier that our sources highlight, some people call the stained glass ceiling. Even in denominations that have theoretically opened the doors, female leaders often face resistance, they receive lower pay, and they struggle immensely to attain those senior leadership positions, often still reserved, maybe implicitly, for men.
Right. And this struggle really underscores the broader tension. Globalization and secular human rights norms are pushing hard for institutional change, demanding, equal application of spiritual gifts regardless of gender. But this is often met with fierce internal resistance from religious conservatives who sometimes view these pressures as a kind of Western cultural imperialism eroding sacred tradition.
So this deep dive really shows us a history that seems less about some unchanging eternal doctrine and maybe more about cultural adaptation over centuries. The marginalization of women in these phases often appears based on cultural accretion and institutional power shifts, not necessarily the core eternal spiritual principles you might find in the earliest texts themselves.
Precisely. The spiritual equality of men and women is often enshrined right alongside the very texts that have been used to maintain hierarchy. Sacred texts just aren't monoliths. They contain the capacity to support both continuity and change, both subordination and equality. It depends how you read them. And this leaves us with a maybe provocative thought for you to consider. If religious traditions continue to evolve based on that spirit of liberation and justice that proponents find within their own foundational texts, what is the next inevitable foundational doctrine that will be re-examined through the lens of modern equity?
That's a powerful question. It connects the history we've just traced right up to the changes happening today and maybe tomorrow. Thank you for sharing your sources and letting us dive into this incredibly complex landscape with you.